Steve Harvey thought it was just another interview, until Keanu Reeves leaned in and whispered, "There's something I've never told anyone, but I need to say it to you." What happened next brought Steve to tears and changed millions forever. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The studio buzzed with its usual anticipation. Camera rigs rolled into place, cue cards were reviewed, an audience primed with laughter filled the seats under the warm glow of production lights. It was supposed to be just another day on the Steve Harvey Show. The set was dressed for joy, not revelation. Steve himself, backstage and reviewing his notes, was in his usual rhythm. Half comedian, half preacher, all heart. "Keanu's not promoting anything?" he asked his assistant, puzzled. "No new movie? No book?" "Nothing," she replied. "He just wanted to come on." That was unusual. Stars didn't just show up to national talk shows unless they had something to sell. But it was Keanu Reeves, and Keanu had always moved a little differently from the rest of Hollywood. As the announcement echoed, "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Keanu Reeves." The applause came easy and wild. He stepped onto the stage in quiet simplicity. Black jeans, soft gray blazer, no stylish polished flash, just Keanu. But it wasn't just his appearance that struck a chord. It was his presence. He moved slower than usual, smiled softer. When he shook Steve's hand and sat down, he didn't flash his signature charm or launch into playful banter. Instead, he looked out across the audience and then down at Steve's chest. More precisely, at the small silver crucifix hanging there. Steve caught it. "You're looking at my necklace," he said, tilting his head slightly with curiosity. "You all right, man?" Keanu blinked slowly, as if surfacing from deep thought. He nodded, but didn't look away from the cross. "I am," he said softly. "It's just that crucifix once saved my life." The laughter faded. Even the hum of background studio equipment seemed to fall silent for a moment. Steve's eyebrows lifted, surprised by the sudden shift in tone. "What do you mean?" he asked, quieter now. Keanu looked him in the eyes, then back down again. "You don't know it, Steve, but years ago, when I was in a really dark place, that crucifix and the words that came with it got me out of bed." The audience, still frozen in attention, collectively leaned forward. You could feel the air shift, thicker, more sacred somehow. This wasn't going to be the kind of segment they'd prepped cue cards for. There was no script for what was about to unfold. Steve, instinctively attuned to moments of real emotion, leaned back in his chair slightly. He set his notes aside. "All right," he said gently. "Then tell me everything." Keanu looked down again, exhaled, and then lifted his eyes. And in that second, before he even spoke another word, everyone watching knew they were no longer at a talk show. They were sitting front row to something far deeper. Keanu adjusted slightly in his chair, shoulders sinking as if releasing something he'd carried for years. "I wasn't planning to say any of this today," he admitted. "Honestly, I wasn't sure I'd ever say it out loud." The audience sat in total stillness. No coughs, no shuffling. Even Steve seemed to forget the cameras existed. He leaned forward, resting his elbows gently on his knees, crucifix glinting beneath the studio lights. "It was a night I don't talk about," Keanu said. "Not to press, not to friends, but maybe it matters now." He looked toward the back wall of the stage, as if remembering the shadows of another time. "There was a moment years ago when everything in my life felt hollow. My sister was sick. I'd lost people I loved. My phone didn't ring anymore unless it was about a movie or a funeral." Steve's face softened, the humor drained from his usual host grin. He wasn't listening like an interviewer now. He was listening like a man. Keanu continued, his voice steady but quiet. "I was alone. And I didn't want to be here. I mean that in every sense. Not in this world, Not in this body, not in this life. A ripple of emotion moved through the audience. A few heads bowed. A few hands moved instinctively toward hearts. I couldn't sleep. Couldn't eat. I kept walking from one side of my apartment to the other, trying to find a reason to keep walking at all. Steve didn't speak. He didn't interrupt. He just let the moment hold itself. And then, Keanu said, I picked up my phone. There was a pause, just enough time for the audience to catch their breath. I wasn't searching for help, I was just scrolling, lost in the nothing. And then, there it was. A clip, a man on stage, talking about pain, faith, God not wasting the hurt you go through. And you, Steve? You were wearing that cross. Steve's eyes glistened. He didn't speak. He simply rested his hand over the crucifix on his chest. You said, if you're still breathing, God's not finished with you yet, Keanu said. And I rewound it, watched it again, and again, and something inside me shifted. There was a quiet gasp in the crowd. That sentence gave me just enough light to get through the next hour. Then the next day. Then the one after that. Keanu turned to Steve, not as a guest to a host, but as one soul to another. I never forgot those words. I never forgot that cross. And I never forgot you. Steve blinked slowly, lips slightly parted. He had heard many things in his career. Confessions, jokes, moments of raw truth. But this was something else entirely. This wasn't about celebrity or a heartwarming anecdote for daytime TV. This was life and death. This was salvation in disguise. I had no idea, Steve finally said, his voice quieter than usual, as if speaking too loudly might break the fragile air in the room. Keanu gave the faintest smile. You weren't trying to change anyone's life. That's what made it real. You weren't performing, you were testifying. The room was silent, not from awkwardness, but reverence. The audience wasn't watching a talk show anymore. They were witnessing a divine appointment between two men who had walked through fire and somehow found each other at the edge of it. Steve looked down at the crucifix again, then slowly removed it from around his neck. He stared at it for a long moment, then looked up at Keanu. You said it saved you. You sure it wasn't the message that did it? Keanu held his gaze. Sometimes the message needs a messenger. And I needed one that night. Steve exhaled, deeply moved. Man, I thought you were coming here to talk about your next movie or something, he said with a shaky laugh. Keanu nodded. I thought so too. A few people in the audience chuckled softly, through tears. But sometimes, Keanu continued, you're not there to promote something. Sometimes you're just supposed to show up. No cameras, no rehearsals, no agenda. Just you. And someone else who's been through it. Steve leaned back, visibly holding back emotion. You know what's wild? He said, tapping his chest. That night I gave that message, I was the one needing saving. I was at my lowest too. Keanu sat forward, eyes sincere. Then maybe you weren't just a messenger, Steve. Maybe you were the message. The camera didn't cut, the applause didn't come. It wasn't the right moment. It was something better than applause. It was silence filled with meaning. And in that stillness, Keanu Reeves sat across from Steve Harvey and said, You saved my life, and I came here today to tell you so you'd never forget your words matter. The crucifix caught the light once more, and the real show was just beginning. The lights in the studio were warm, soft, casting a golden glow across the set. But the energy had shifted entirely. The audience, once lively with anticipation, now leaned forward in silence, not the kind born from boredom or confusion, but from reverence. Keanu Reeves sat across from Steve Harvey, his hands loosely clasped, his voice measured and low, not performing, not promoting, just present. I guess, Keanu began, eyes distant, I should start with the night I thought I wouldn't wake up. Steve didn't speak. He didn't need to. One hand rested gently on the arm of his chair, the other still close to the crucifix that hung from his neck. The audience was still. Even the camera operators seemed to pause. Keanu's voice didn't crack. That would come later, but the weight behind it was enough to make hearts ache. "It was after I lost Jennifer," he said, "and our daughter." He looked up briefly. Her name was Ava. The name lingered in the air like incense, soft, sacred, and full of something you didn't want to touch for fear it might disappear. He didn't explain who Jennifer Syme was. He didn't need to. Most of the world knew. The woman he loved, the child they were expecting, the unspeakable grief when both were gone. "She was born still," he said softly. "Just still." A pause. I didn't know how to mourn something that hadn't lived a day outside of her mother's womb, but I felt like I had known her forever. I imagined the way she'd laugh. I imagined what she'd call me when she was old enough to say Dad. He swallowed. The silence was thunderous. "And then, 2 weeks later," Keanu continued, "Jennifer was gone too. A car accident." Steve's eyes lowered slightly, his face unreadable. But anyone who's ever carried grief could see it there. Understanding, compassion, heartbreak. "I remember this moment in my apartment," Keanu said. "The light was off. I hadn't turned it on in hours, maybe days. I don't remember. There was just this hum in the air. That sound your fridge makes when nothing else is happening. That was the only sound." Another pause. I sat on the floor, no music, no TV, just silence. And it didn't feel peaceful. It felt like being buried alive. The crowd barely breathed. "I didn't want to die," he said, "but I also didn't want to keep doing life like that. Does that make sense?" Steve nodded slowly, his lips pressed together in a line of sorrow and respect. Keanu's fingers curled inward, as if wrapping themselves around something invisible. "That night I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't even cry. I picked up my phone just to stare at something, anything, and I started scrolling. Not really looking, just avoiding, trying to not feel." His voice dropped lower. "And then I came across a clip." Steve blinked once, deep. "It was you." Keanu paused for a moment, as if the memory required more care than the words themselves. He looked over at Steve, not smiling, not seeking approval, just grounding himself in the man who unknowingly helped him climb out of a pit. "You were on stage," Keanu said quietly. "Not in a suit, not in a studio like this, just you, raw, honest. The backdrop was dark and the lighting wasn't perfect, but it didn't matter. What you were saying, how you said it, it felt like you were talking to me. Only me." Steve's eyebrows knit together slightly, caught between humility and awe. "I watched you talk about storms," Keanu continued. "You said, sometimes the thing that's breaking you is really breaking you open. And man," he exhaled slowly, "I felt like you had just named what was happening inside me." There was a tremor in Keanu's hands now, not from nerves, but from memory. He didn't try to hide it. "You said, God doesn't waste pain." And I remember looking around my dark apartment and thinking, what if that's true? The audience was completely still. No phones, no coughs. Just the weight of one man's private agony being shared in front of millions. "I watched that clip 3 times that night," Keanu said. "The first time I watched it, I didn't move. The second time, I started crying, but not loud. You know that kind of crying where it's just your eyes leaking, but everything inside is locked up?" Steve nodded. He knew. "And the third time," Keanu said, "I heard something I hadn't heard in years. Hope." He didn't dramatize it, didn't wrap it in poetic metaphors, just said it plainly, like it had taken everything in him to find that word again and bring it to the surface. Hope that maybe I wasn't completely lost. Steve's hand found the crucifix at his chest again, like instinct. He didn't speak. "You ended that clip with a sentence I will never forget," Keanu said. You looked out at the crowd and you said, "If you're still breathing, God's not finished with you yet." He let the words land. Even though he was quoting, they felt new again, reborn in that space. I didn't jump up, he added. It wasn't some Hollywood moment where I had this grand epiphany, but I stood up. For the first time in days, I walked to the window. I looked out. I remember the way the city lights flickered in the distance. It wasn't a miracle, but it was a beginning. His voice softened almost to a whisper. You gave me a beginning, Steve, and you didn't even know it. Steve inhaled deeply, his face unreadable, but his eyes were wet. Man, he started, but his voice caught. Steve opened his mouth again, but said nothing. His lips parted, his hand still gripping the crucifix. The weight of what Keanu had just shared wasn't just personal. It was sacred. This wasn't a celebrity anecdote. It was testimony. Keanu leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees, eyes focused but distant, like he was still half in that memory. I wasn't raised in a church, he said, and I've had a complicated relationship with faith. But that night, your words cut through all the noise. Not just yours, but something behind them. It wasn't preachy. It wasn't scripted. It was real, and real was the only thing I could hear. The studio was dead silent. Even the cameras seemed to quiet themselves, as if out of respect. You weren't trying to save anyone, Keanu added. That's what made it powerful. You were just telling the truth, from your own storm. And in doing that, you reached someone sitting in a different kind of darkness. Steve leaned back in his chair now, eyes closed for a long moment. His hand still touched the cross, but it was no longer from habit. It was reverence, gratitude, maybe even disbelief. Then, without looking up, Steve whispered, "You have no idea what that means to me." "I think I do," Keanu replied gently. Finally, Steve sat up and looked at him. His expression was raw, stripped of every performance instinct he'd learned in decades of showbiz. He was just a man who'd said something years ago that had unknowingly become a lifeline for someone else. Keanu offered a small, warm smile. "I never intended to say all this today. I didn't come here to make headlines. I just came because I needed you to know." Steve let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "You came here to give me something, didn't you?" Keanu nodded. "Yeah. Closure. And maybe a mirror. Because you reminded me who I was when I had forgotten. And now, I think it's time I remind you who you are." A pause. "I think," Keanu said softly, "you're more than what you think you are, Steve." The lights above them seemed softer now. The audience still hadn't moved. What had started as a light-hearted interview had turned into something spiritual, something intimate. Steve's eyes glistened, his voice low and cracked. "And what's that?" Keanu looked straight into his eyes and whispered, "You're not just a comedian or a talk show host. You're a minister in disguise." The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was full, heavy, sacred. And the story was only just beginning. The silence that followed Keanu's confession wasn't awkward, it was sacred. Steve Harvey sat back in his chair, momentarily speechless. His hand moved instinctively to the crucifix on his chest, the same one Keanu had mentioned, the same one he'd worn during that late-night taping years ago. His fingers tightened around it, as if grounding himself in something bigger than the moment, something divine. I don't even remember filming that," Steve finally said, his voice raw, shaky. Keanu nodded slowly. "That's what made it real." Steve tilted his head, confused. Keanu leaned forward, eyes steady but soft. "You weren't preaching," he said gently. "You were surviving out loud." Those words landed like thunder in a quiet church. Steve blinked hard, taken aback, not because he didn't understand, but because he understood exactly. That night, the one Keanu was talking about, had been one of the lowest points in his own life. He hadn't planned the message, he hadn't rehearsed it, He just turned on the camera and talked, because he didn't know what else to do. That night, Steve said slowly, I was trying to hold myself together. I didn't know if anyone would even hear it. I did, Keanu replied, and I needed it. The weight of that sentence sat heavy in the room. Keanu sat back a little, taking a deep breath. You said, if you're still breathing, God's not finished with you. He repeated the words carefully, as if they were scripture etched into memory. You didn't shout it. You didn't preach it. You just meant it. And I believed you. Steve's eyes welled up, not just with emotion, but with a sudden understanding of the reach his pain had found. For years, he'd spoken into cameras, into microphones, into silence, never knowing who, if anyone, was really listening. And that was the moment, Keanu continued, when something shifted inside me. Just enough to move, just enough to want to wake up the next day. There was no pride in his tone, no dramatics, just truth, honest and trembling. Steve wiped his eyes, but didn't speak. The audience, too, remained still. The usual applause, laughter, or even murmurs were absent. It was a different kind of show tonight, one made of real-time transformation, not entertainment. I started showing up differently after that, Keanu said. Not just on set, not just with fans, but with people. All people. Steve looked at him, trying to form a response, but no words came. Keanu's next sentence landed like a revelation. You were a lighthouse, he said, to someone you never met. That's ministry, Steve. Steve's hands were clasped together now, knuckles white, resting just beneath his chin. He wasn't trying to perform. He wasn't hosting anymore. He was simply a man, one who had spoken life into a stranger and was only now realizing it. I wasn't trying to help anyone, Steve finally whispered. I was just hurting. That's the irony of it, Keanu said, his voice low, calm. You weren't trying to inspire. You weren't wearing a mask or trying to be wise. You were just being honest, and that honesty reached me like nothing else ever had. Steve looked away for a moment, his jaw tight, the crucifix still in his grasp. It's wild, man. All the comedy, all the motivational speeches, the shows, and it's the one message I barely remember filming that changed your life. Keanu smiled, but it was soft, distant. That's how grace works. It shows up in the places you least expect it. It doesn't always come wrapped in lights or applause. Sometimes it's just a late-night video from a man with nothing left to give, but who still gave something. The air shifted again. Even the cameras seemed to hum quieter, sensing the magnitude of what was unfolding. Keanu leaned in a little closer, looking Steve in the eye. You talked about purpose. Not the kind they teach in books. The kind you learn when life breaks you open and leaves you standing in the rubble. That kind. Steve was visibly shaking now. A tear slipped down his cheek, unchecked. He didn't wipe it away. I thought I was alone, Keanu continued. Completely. Like the world had turned silent. But when I heard you speak, I realized I wasn't. That maybe, just maybe, God still saw me. That maybe pain could still lead to purpose. The words hung in the air, untouched. Steve opened his mouth to say something but closed it again, overwhelmed. You never knew, did you? Keanu asked, not accusing, just observing. Steve shook his head slowly. Not until right now. Keanu reached out, placing a gentle hand on Steve's arm. You don't know how far your light goes, Steve. You don't have to. For a long moment they sat in silence, not the empty kind, the holy kind. The kind of silence that only arrives when truth has just walked through the door and everyone in the room is trying to catch their breath. Steve exhaled slowly, finally speaking again, his voice rough around the edges. You know, when I recorded that message, I was at the edge of something myself. I was exhausted, questioning everything. My own faith, my own voice. I didn't think anybody was listening. Keanu nodded. That's why it mattered. You weren't speaking at people, you were speaking from somewhere real, somewhere broken. That's where the light comes from, Steve. Not from the perfect places, from the cracks. The words stung in the best way. Steve's head lowered, his shoulders curled slightly inward, like the weight of all the years had finally settled on his back, and someone had finally noticed. Keanu continued. That message, it shifted something in me. I stopped measuring life by what I lost. I started looking at people differently, gentler. I walked onto film sets with more humility. I listened more. I asked deeper questions. I tried to live with presence, not just motion. Steve wiped his face with both hands, but the tears kept coming. There was no shame, just release. You know what you were that night? Keanu asked quietly. Steve looked up, his eyes rimmed with red. A lighthouse, Keanu said. Not shouting at ships, just shining, quiet, steady. You didn't know who needed it, you just kept the light on. Steve's lip quivered, and for a moment, he looked like a child hearing he mattered for the first time. Keanu leaned back in his chair, letting the weight of those words breathe in the space between them. That's ministry, Steve. That's what it is. Not sermons, not stages, just living with love loud enough that someone in the dark can find their way. The studio audience was silent, every soul anchored in the sacredness of what they'd just witnessed. Steve nodded slowly, chest rising and falling with emotion. No one's ever said that to me before, he whispered. Maybe no one had the words, Keanu said, but I do. Because I was the one you reached. They sat there, two men with pain and faith woven into every corner of their stories. One had spoken life without knowing, the other had lived because of it. And in that moment, it wasn't about Hollywood. It wasn't about fame. It was about the quiet miracle of one broken soul lighting the path for another. There was a pause, not the kind that comes from confusion or hesitation, but the kind that follows the opening of a wound too deep to immediately cover. Steve leaned back slightly in his chair, still reeling from what Keanu had just revealed. The impact of a midnight video clip, filmed when Steve himself was questioning his worth. But Keanu didn't let the silence stretch too long. He looked down at his hands as if they held memories instead of fingers. Then he spoke, not as the movie star the world adored, but as the boy behind the fame. I never really told anyone the whole truth, he began, voice quiet but steady. Not about the beginning. Steve leaned in, sensing a shift. My father left when I was young. Not just left the house, he disappeared. One day he was there, the next he was a ghost. My mother tried, she really did, but she was working multiple jobs and I got lost in the gaps. He paused. I used to pretend I was invisible, not because I wanted to be, but because I felt like I already was. Steve swallowed hard, watching the man beside him peel back decades of silence. There was this one night, Keanu continued. I must have been 10 or 11. I was sitting on the back steps of our place in Toronto. It was cold, and I had this sketchbook I used to draw in. I don't even know why, but I drew a lighthouse, over and over, page after page. It wasn't even that good, he added with a small laugh. But it was the only thing I could think of that stayed in one place, shining no matter what. The metaphor wasn't lost on Steve. And then there was Kim, my sister, Keanu went on. When she got sick, it felt like the last person who really saw me was being taken away. His voice cracked slightly, but he didn't stop. I used to sit with her at the hospital. We'd play cards, listen to music. And she'd say the same thing every time I left. Don't disappear, okay? He blinked quickly, forcing the tears back. I didn't know what she meant back then, but now I think she saw the part of me that had already started to fade. Steve nodded slowly, his heart breaking a little more with every word. You ever feel like no one sees the real you? Keanu asked suddenly, turning the question gently toward Steve. The talk show host didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached up and touched the crucifix around his neck. A familiar gesture, a quiet search for balance. Then, finally, every single day. Steve's voice was low, almost swallowed by the space between them. People think being in the spotlight means you're seen. But man, the spotlight doesn't see you. It just lights you up for others to watch. He shook his head gently, his gaze drifting somewhere far off. When I was a kid, I used to pray for someone to look at me and see me. Not the act, not the jokes, just me. Keanu nodded, his eyes locked on Steve's. That's what I meant when I said your message saved me. You weren't trying to inspire anyone. You were just surviving out loud. Steve exhaled a shaky breath. You ever hear something from your own mouth, years later, and not recognize it until someone else repeats it back to you? Keanu smiled faintly. All the time. There was something soft in the air between them now, like two men sitting on opposite sides of the same old wound. Different stories, same ache. Steve looked down at his hands. I was homeless once, slept in my car, ate saltines for dinner, and every day I'd look at myself in the mirror of that rear view and think, you're not good enough. Not for this dream, not for anything. Keanu's brow furrowed with empathy, but he didn't interrupt. I remember the first time someone laughed at one of my jokes, Steve said. Not just laughed, but really laughed. Man, that laugh felt like sunlight, and I've been chasing that sound ever since. Not because I want the fame, but because it reminds me, I'm still here. I still matter. Keanu leaned in slightly. It's wild, isn't it? How the things we do to survive, sometimes they become our gift to others. Steve looked up, his eyes glistening. That's what you've done, man. Every time you show up in a movie, or hold the door open, or sit on the subway like a regular guy, you're telling someone else you are not invisible. Keanu looked down for a moment, then back at Steve. I think we carry our pain in silence because we're afraid it'll scare people away. Steve nodded slowly. But what I'm learning, Keanu continued, is that when you show someone your scar, it doesn't make them turn away. It makes them say, me too. The audience, still hushed, seemed to lean in with them, not for drama, not for spectacle, but for truth. Steve's voice came softer now. So when you saw my video that night, the one about pain and purpose, what did you feel? Keanu didn't hesitate. I felt seen, not as an actor, not as a name, as a soul. Steve blinked slowly, the weight of the moment sinking deep. That's all any of us want, isn't it? Keanu sat quietly for a long moment before answering. I think we all spend years trying to be understood without ever showing who we really are. That's the irony of it. Steve nodded solemnly. You said earlier that you've only felt truly seen when someone else showed you their real first? Yeah, Keanu said, his voice barely above a whisper. When someone dares to be honest about their hurt, their fears, their regrets, it gives you permission to breathe differently around them, to stop performing. That's what your message did. It showed me you're real, and it let mine out of hiding. Steve leaned back, visibly moved. Man, that's ministry, whether we meant to or not. The camera zoomed out slightly, but the room still felt as intimate as a whisper between two souls. No applause, just reverence. Keanu looked out toward the quiet audience. I've played a lot of roles, worn a lot of masks, but that video, it made me want to strip all of them away. Not to be someone new, just to be. Steve placed a hand over his heart. That's the thing, Keanu. I've been asking God for years if what I say actually matters, if just being open about my own mess could mean something. Keanu turned to him, his voice steady but full. It did, and it does. You weren't performing. You were bleeding truth. And in that bleeding, I found a reason to stay. Steve blinked hard, holding back tears again. I didn't know I was talking to someone like you that night. That's the thing, Keanu replied. You weren't talking to me. You were just speaking from your brokenness. That's why it reached so deep. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The audience didn't move. Something holy had taken root, not in religion, but in raw, unfiltered humanity. Then Steve asked quietly, "You think people like us, the ones who smile while bleeding, ever really heal?" Keanu looked at him, eyes clear and sure. "I think we heal in layers. Every time someone tells us, 'I see you, I hear you, you matter,' that's one more layer stitched." Steve sat back, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "I think you just stitched one for me, man." Keanu smiled gently. "Then we're even." The lights dimmed just slightly as the segment transitioned. But in that space, the truth had already been spoken. Not for cameras, not for ratings, but for something far deeper. The shared ache of being human, and the quiet hope of being seen through it. Keanu sat forward in his chair, elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the small cross resting over Steve Harvey's chest. The light above them caught on the metal, casting a faint reflection, subtle but present. There was a gravity in Keanu's gaze now, as though something long buried was rising to the surface. "That cross," he said quietly, "was the first thing I noticed in your video." Steve looked down instinctively, fingers brushing over the crucifix. "This?" he asked, a little surprised. "Before I even opened my mouth?" Keanu nodded. "I was in the dark, literally and emotionally. My phone was the only light in the room, and then there you were, speaking. But before the words even reached me, that cross caught my eye. It told me something." "What did it tell you?" Steve asked, his voice softened now, tuned to the depth of what was unfolding. Keanu paused. He looked like a man trying to find the exact shape of a truth he'd never dared to voice. "It told me that you believed in something bigger than yourself, something that had seen your pain and walked with you anyway. That cross, it gave me a reason to keep watching, and eventually, a reason to keep breathing." The studio was still. "I didn't grow up in church," Keanu went on. "I wasn't handed faith in a neat package. But in that moment, when I saw you holding that cross and speaking about purpose, something moved. I thought, maybe I'm not alone in this." Steve's mouth opened slightly, but he didn't speak. He just listened. And for once, the man known for punchlines and comebacks let the silence do the talking. Keanu shifted slightly in his seat, his voice still gentle. "I don't think people realize how much we notice when we're at rock bottom. The small things. A gesture, a tone, a symbol. That cross. It wasn't just jewelry that night. It was a signal." Steve blinked hard, nodding slowly. "It reminded me," Keanu added, "that maybe the pain didn't mean I was abandoned. Maybe it meant I was being seen." The words hung in the air, rich with something sacred. Steve looked down at the crucifix again, now with a deeper reverence. "You know," he said after a moment, "this belonged to my mother. She gave it to me when I was a mess of a young man, running from everything. She told me, 'Keep it close. One day, it'll mean more to you than you understand.'" Keanu's eyes softened. "It already does." He looked at Steve's chest again, the cross resting there, steady. "I've never told anyone this before," Keanu said, his voice dropping even lower. "But that cross is why I'm still here." Steve's expression changed. No longer the host, no longer the man who commanded a stage with jokes or warmth. Now he was just a son, a man holding onto the last thread of something passed down with love, worn not for show, but for survival. Keanu leaned forward slowly, eyes still on the cross. "Would it be all right if I touched it?" he asked, his voice fragile, reverent. Steve didn't hesitate. He leaned toward him, gently placing the chain in Keanu's open hand, their heads bowed slightly, two men sharing a silent exchange, far more profound than words. Keanu's fingers closed softly around the cross, holding it like a whisper. His thumb brushed over its worn surface, as if trying to absorb its memory, its meaning. "I used to think that symbols were for people who needed something to cling to," Keanu said quietly. "But I was wrong. When I saw you wearing this, speaking truth, while carrying your own pain, it told me that strength doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it just looks faithful. Steve blinked hard, swallowing emotion that rose too fast to hide. She gave me that when I had nothing, he said. Said it would bring me back when I felt lost. I didn't always listen, but it always found its way around my neck again. I think it found its way to me too, Keanu replied. There was a pause as Keanu held the cross a moment longer, then carefully placed it back against Steve's chest. Their eyes met. You ever feel like someone up there leaves breadcrumbs in the dark? Keanu asked. Like they're not yelling at you, just quietly saying, keep going? Steve nodded, deeply moved. Yeah, I've felt that. Keanu sat back, hands resting on his thighs, his eyes shining, not with tears, but with something clearer. That night, when I saw you, the cross, your message, it wasn't about religion to me. It was about connection. Someone who didn't know me was speaking directly to me. And you think it was this little thing? Steve asked, fingers grazing the chain. No, Keanu said gently, not just the thing, the spirit behind it. It told me you carried pain like I did, and still stood. Steve looked down again. I never knew. I filmed that late. I was hurting bad that night. I didn't think anyone was watching, not really. I was, Keanu said simply. That truth landed like a stone in the heart of the room. There was no audience applause, just presence, just breath. You said something in that clip I'll never forget, Keanu added. You said, if you're still breathing, God's not finished with you. I didn't believe in much that night, but I believed in that. Steve exhaled, chest rising slowly. Keanu looked at him again, more grounded now. That belief saved me. And with that, the cross between them wasn't just a chain or a story. It was a bridge. Steve sat quietly, the crucifix now resting against his chest again, only it felt heavier now, not in weight, but in memory. His mother's gift had survived decades, but now it had outlived even her original intention. It had become something else. A thread that stitched two lives together, his and Keanu's. In the silence between screens. I used to think this was just for me, Steve murmured, eyes distant. Like a lifeline God gave me during my lowest times. I never imagined it'd be someone else's. Keanu nodded slowly. That's the thing about light. We don't always know where it lands. We just shine anyway. There was a quiet moment between them. Keanu glanced down, fingers steepled in thought. You know, he said, I've worn costumes and armor, stepped into roles that required strength, vengeance, justice. But it wasn't until I saw someone like you, just speaking honestly with that cross on, that I realized what real courage looked like. Steve smiled faintly. Just trying to survive, man. Just trying to help somebody else breathe. Keanu leaned back a little, letting out a slow breath of his own. I used to think my silence made me invisible, he said. But what I've come to understand is silence isn't absence. It's invitation. When I saw that video, it was like silence was finally answered. The crowd in the studio remained utterly still, sensing something sacred in the air. This wasn't a performance. This wasn't a celebrity interview. This was testimony, spoken between breaths. Steve leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You know, the night I recorded that video, I wasn't trying to reach the world. I was trying to stop myself from breaking. I was raw, man. I didn't know if what I was saying even made sense. Keanu looked at him with something that resembled peace. That's what made it holy. You weren't preaching. You were surviving out loud. That's what I connected to. You were bleeding and still offering hope. Steve's eyes welled up again, but this time there was no shame in it. Man, I've done a lot of shows, a lot of moments, but I never thought something I filmed in my worst pain would save somebody in theirs. You did, Keanu said simply. "You didn't save me because you had the answers. You saved me because you had the courage to speak when it hurt." Then Keanu said something that would stay with Steve forever. "You were a lighthouse to someone you'd never met. That's ministry, Steve, whether you asked for it or not." Steve covered his mouth for a moment, overwhelmed. Then he lowered his hand and whispered, "That's the heaviest compliment I've ever received." Keanu reached across, laid a hand gently on Steve's shoulder. "It's not a compliment," he said softly. "It's the truth." The room remained suspended in quiet reverence. 2 men, 2 pasts, 1 crucifix, and a bridge made of grace. The lights on stage felt gentler now, as if dimmed by the weight of truth. Steve Harvey sat still in his chair, the crucifix at his chest clutched loosely in one hand. Across from him, Keanu Reeves leaned forward slightly, his eyes never wavering from Steve's. The air between them wasn't heavy, it was sacred. There was a hush in the studio, not imposed, but earned. Keanu's voice cut through the silence, not loud, not theatrical, just steady. "Steve," he said, "I've spent my whole life surrounded by people who talk for a living. Directors, actors, press agents, fans. Words come easy in my world, but not everyone's words hit the soul. Yours did." Steve nodded slowly, unsure of where the conversation was going, but willing to follow. His fingers remained on the cross, his lips pressing together. "I've wanted to tell you this for years," Keanu continued, "but I never had the courage to say it out loud. Tonight, something told me I needed to." He shifted in his seat, adjusting himself as though about to reveal something deeply buried. "You're not just a host," Keanu said quietly. "You're not just a comedian or a TV personality. You're something else entirely." Steve raised an eyebrow, a half smile creeping onto his lips, maybe to lighten the moment. "Man, don't do that. I'm just a dude with a mic who's been lucky enough to keep a job." Keanu didn't smile back. "No, Steve," he said firmly. "You're a minister in disguise." The studio stilled. Not one cough, not one shift of a chair. Steve's smile faded. Not from offense, but from something else. Something deeper. Recognition, maybe. Or disbelief. "I mean it," Keanu said. "You think you're just cracking jokes, making people laugh, getting through life. But every time you've spoken from your pain, from your truth, you've been preaching. You've been ministering. You've been giving people something they didn't know they needed." Steve's head tilted slightly and his eyes welled up. Not the kind of emotional reflex you fake for ratings, but the kind that comes from being seen too clearly. "You really believe that?" he whispered. Keanu nodded. "I don't just believe it, I know it, because it saved me." Steve's throat tightened. His hand rose to his mouth briefly, as if to cover what he was feeling. But he didn't speak. He couldn't. Keanu leaned back for a moment, giving the space time to breathe. "You weren't trying to save anyone, and that's exactly why you did." Steve took a slow breath, but it trembled as it left his lungs. His shoulders rose, then sank again, and his hand, still cradling the crucifix, dropped into his lap as if he were too tired to keep pretending. "You know," Steve finally said, his voice low, rough, "I've had a lot of people tell me I've made them laugh, helped them through something. I always appreciate it, truly. But this," he paused, shaking his head, "this hits different." Keanu didn't press. He waited. Steve continued, his gaze cast downward. "There were nights I was backstage right before a show. Man, I was barely holding it together. And I'd look at myself in the mirror and say, 'Smile, Steve. Be funny. They didn't come to see your pain.' And so I buried it. I made people laugh so they wouldn't hear me cry." Keanu leaned forward. "That's what made it real. You were surviving out loud, and we felt it. People don't just connect to the jokes. They connect to the struggle you never named, but they could feel." Steve's eyes glossed again. "I never thought of it like that. I never felt like I was good enough to be anything more." Keanu's voice softened. You didn't have to feel like it. You were chosen anyway. Steve glanced up sharply. Chosen? Keanu nodded. Yeah, not by agents, not by networks, by something higher. God doesn't always call the qualified. He qualifies the called. And sometimes he chooses people who've been through hell because they know how to speak to the ones still walking through it. That hit Steve like a wave. He looked away, wiping his cheek quickly, but not hiding the tears this time. You know, Keanu said, a lot of people in this industry think power is about being heard, but I've learned real power is about making others feel seen. And you, Steve, you see people. Steve exhaled, long and shaky. I never thought that made me anything special. I just thought it made me human. Keanu smiled gently. That's exactly what makes it special. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was reverent, the kind that wraps around two people when they've accidentally stumbled into sacred ground. Keanu's tone lowered once more. Sometimes your pain is your pulpit, and you don't even know it. That line landed like thunder. Steve closed his eyes. For once, he didn't try to laugh it off. He didn't deflect. He just sat there, letting the truth wash over him. You really believe that? He asked again, voice nearly broken. Keanu nodded, this time not just with conviction, but with gratitude. I'm living proof. The studio lights seemed to dim naturally, as if the moment itself demanded softer edges. The crowd remained silent, many of them leaning forward without realizing it, eyes locked on two men who had stripped away every layer of performance. Steve sat back, his hands now loosely clasped in front of him, the crucifix still visible on his chest. You know what's wild? He whispered. I never wanted to be a preacher. Never saw myself as anything close to that. I was just trying to survive, pay bills, make folks laugh, keep my own heart from collapsing. Keanu leaned in, calm and present. And in doing that, you ministered to more people than most pulpits ever could. Steve blinked, trying to hold on to composure. But why me, man? Of all the people God could use. Because you didn't need the spotlight, Keanu said, and that's why the light found you. A hush rippled through the room. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. With no ego, no performance, just truth, raw and sacred. Steve looked down again, this time at the floor. You really think I've helped people? Like actually helped? Not just entertained? Keanu nodded. I know you have. You helped me. When I didn't think I could be helped, when I was lost in grief and silence, it was your voice, shaky, tired, unpolished, that cracked something open inside me. Steve's chin quivered. But I didn't know you were watching. I didn't know anyone was. That's the beauty of it, Keanu said. Ministry doesn't need an audience. It just needs authenticity. Steve looked up again, and this time his eyes were clearer, not because the tears had stopped, but because something had settled in him. Like a weight he didn't know he was carrying had finally been named. And you're telling me I mattered to someone, Steve said, his voice low. Keanu nodded. You mattered to me, and I bet you've mattered to thousands more who never got the chance to tell you. The crowd didn't move. A few sniffled. Others stared straight ahead, as if holding back their own emotions. But no one looked away. Keanu sat back gently, his voice now just above a whisper. You didn't set out to be a lighthouse, Steve. But that's what you became, for me, for others. You're not just a host, or a comedian, or a man with a microphone. He paused. You're a minister in disguise. Steve dropped his head into his hands again, this time not out of shame, but out of reverence. The applause didn't come yet. It wasn't time. The truth had landed, and it needed to breathe. The cameras were still rolling, but it felt like no one remembered. The energy in the studio had shifted again, this time not from silence, but something deeper. A reverence. A presence. Even the crew moved slower, like they didn't want to break whatever sacred thing had just begun unfolding between Steve and Keanu. Then, from behind the curtain, a quiet voice broke the stillness. "Can I say something?" Heads turned. A man in his mid-30s stepped forward. Stage crew, wires clipped to his shirt, headset looped around his neck. He looked nervous, eyes darting from Keanu to Steve and back again. Steve tilted his head, curious but welcoming. "You okay, brother?" The man nodded. "Yeah, I need to tell you something before this show ends." The audience waited. "You probably don't remember," he said, stepping into the soft spotlight. "But 5 years ago, I was working on your set for Family Feud. I was going through a divorce. My mom had just been diagnosed with cancer. I showed up every day because I needed the paycheck, but I was drowning." His voice trembled. "Home day, I was late. I thought I was going to be fired, but you," he looked at Steve, eyes moist, "you pulled me aside. You didn't yell. You looked at me and said, 'Whatever it is, it's not going to take you out. God still has plans for you.'" The man swallowed hard. That sentence got me through the darkest season of my life. The audience exhaled together, like they'd been holding their breath. Steve's lips parted, stunned. "I said that?" "You said it like it was nothing," the crewman said with a teary smile. "But it meant everything." Another voice came from the audience, a woman, hand over her heart. "You helped me too," she whispered. "I was in an abusive relationship when I heard you speak at a church in Atlanta. You said God gives us permission to leave what's killing us. I walked away that night. I never looked back. And just like that, the studio wasn't a set anymore. It was a sanctuary." Steve blinked. His fingers instinctively touched the cross at his chest, as if it was the only anchor left. Keanu turned to him, his voice gentle, reverent. "You think you've just been talking, hosting, entertaining, but Steve," he paused, locking eyes, "you've been carrying light, quietly, humbly, and people have been following it. Through darkness, they didn't know they'd survive." Steve didn't respond right away. His chest rose and fell, his hand still gripping that crucifix like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. Keanu continued, softer now. "That's why I call you a beacon for the broken. Because your light didn't come from ease. It came from pain that refused to give up." Steve closed his eyes, and the whole world waited for what would come next. Steve opened his eyes slowly. The weight of the moment pressed into his chest like something sacred. He wasn't a stranger to emotion. He had wept on camera before, laughed until he choked on stage. But this was different. This was soul deep. His voice, when it finally came, was low and uneven. "I've thought about quitting," he said, almost to himself. The room went silent again. Keanu didn't flinch. He just listened. Steve's voice cracked. "I've had seasons where I looked at the mirror and thought, maybe I've done all I can. Maybe I'm used up. Maybe I'm not enough." He blinked slowly. The cross at his chest shimmered under the stage lights. "I thought I was just surviving day to day, hosting one more show, saying one more joke, trying to smile when I was empty inside." Keanu stepped forward. No spotlight, no music, just presence. "That's why you're chosen," he said. Steve looked up at him, confused. "You're not perfect," Keanu continued. "You've been through it. You've made mistakes, you've doubted. But that's exactly why people believe you. Because you don't speak from the mountaintop. You speak from the valley, and you've walked it." Steve let out a quiet, broken laugh, wiping under his eyes. "Man, I don't know if I can carry that." Keanu didn't look away. "You already are. You always have." The crew member from earlier stood off stage now, head bowed in silent agreement. Audience members were crying openly. A few had clasped hands with strangers. One woman simply held her chest, like something in her heart had just broken open and begun to heal. Then Steve said something no one expected. "Sometimes I ask God, why me?" The words trembled as they left his mouth. He didn't dress them up. He didn't try to be strong. He just let the question hang in the air like smoke. Keanu stepped closer, his voice low and unwavering. "Because pain makes you real, and real people change lives." Steve nodded, tears returning. "But I never planned to carry any of this." "You didn't have to," Keanu replied. "That's what makes it holy. You weren't trying to be a leader. That's why people followed." Steve covered his face for a moment, breathing in, shaking slightly. When he looked up again, his eyes were bloodshot, but there was a flicker of something else now. Peace. He looked around at the room, at the crew member, the crying audience, the quiet cameras, and said softly, "Maybe I am carrying something sacred." The words weren't a declaration, they were a confession. Keanu nodded once. "You are." Steve exhaled, a deep, trembling breath that seemed to leave behind the weight of decades. Then he whispered one more sentence. "I just didn't know anybody noticed." Keanu smiled gently, the light in his eyes soft but firm. "We did." The applause never came. No one clapped. Not because they weren't moved, because they were. So moved, in fact, that to break the silence would have felt like stepping into a sacred space with muddy shoes. A young woman near the front row finally whispered, just loud enough for the people around her to hear, "He saved me too." Steve turned slightly toward her, eyes wet again. Their gazes met for a beat. He didn't need to ask her how or when or why. The look on her face told him everything. He gave her a small, almost trembling nod. Keanu saw it and stepped back, letting the connection between them bloom in quiet. Then, turning to the audience, he spoke, not loudly but clearly, like someone placing words where wounds used to live. "Do you know what it means to be a light?" he asked. "It means shining even when no one tells you that you are." He turned back to Steve. "You've been doing that for years, man." Quietly, reluctantly, but relentlessly. Steve looked down, then back at him. "And all this time, I thought I was just talking." Keanu smiled. "You weren't talking. You were testifying." Steve shook his head slightly. "But I'm not a preacher." Keanu didn't miss a beat. "No, you're not. That's what makes it real. You didn't need a pulpit, you had pain. You didn't need a robe, you had a mic." Steve laughed gently through his tears. "You're gonna make me start a church up here." The audience chuckled softly, but it wasn't out of amusement. It was out of relief. Something was being released from the room. Grief, maybe, or doubt, or the long-held belief that brokenness disqualifies us from doing something meaningful. Keanu walked over to Steve's chair and stood beside him. "I think there are a lot of people," he said slowly, "watching this right now, who have no idea that their scars are the very reason they're qualified to lead, to love, to lift." Steve looked up at him, hands still resting on the crucifix. "You really believe that?" Keanu nodded. "I'm living proof." And for the first time that night, Steve didn't cry. He just breathed, long and slow and full. Then he stood. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't wave to the audience or raise his hands or bow his head. He just stood, taller than before. Keanu stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder. And in the soft light of the studio, with a few tears still shining on their cheeks, two men, one an actor, one a comedian, looked at each other like brothers. No applause, just reverence. Because sometimes the greatest sermons come from men who never meant to preach. And sometimes the people carrying the most light don't even know they're glowing. Backstage, away from the lights and applause, a gentle quiet settled over the room. No cue cards, no camera crew, just two men sitting in the afterglow of something holy. Steve Harvey had asked for a moment alone with Keanu, not for show, not for a finale, just for the soul. The dressing room was modest. Two leather chairs, a mirror lined with lights, and a wooden side table with a single Bible resting on top. The door clicked shut behind them. Silence followed. A different kind of silence. Not awkward, not forced. Sacred. Keanu didn't speak first. He simply sat down slowly, as if the chair itself carried meaning. Steve followed, his usual confidence traded in for a quiet vulnerability. A full minute passed. Neither man moved. And then Keanu broke the silence, not with a speech, but with a question, so soft it could have gone unheard if the room weren't already listening. "Can we pray?" Steve didn't answer. He just nodded. They bowed their heads, not with perfection, not with pretense. Just two broken men trying to touch something holy. There were no rehearsed lines, no practiced faith. Just raw breath and trembling hands. Keanu whispered first. That he didn't use eloquent phrases. He didn't sound like a priest or a preacher. But it was prayer. Real prayer. "God, thank you for this moment, for him, for this mercy I didn't see coming." Steve added in quietly, "And thank you for showing us we're not alone." Their voices overlapped, sometimes unsure, sometimes silent, but neither let go of that moment. They sat in it. Two lives connected by pain, now lifted by something beyond either of them. When they finally lifted their heads, the room didn't feel the same. It was fuller, warmer, like something invisible had sat down with them and stayed. Steve reached under his shirt and slowly pulled the crucifix chain from his neck. He held it in both hands, like it weighed something now. "This cross," he said gently, "belonged to my mother." Keanu's eyes softened. "I thought so," he whispered. "It looked like it came from someone who prayed with their whole life." Steve smiled. "She did. She didn't have much, but she had God, and she passed that down to me. Through struggle, through silence, through survival." He looked at Keanu, not as a host, not even as a friend, but as a brother in spirit. "I've carried this cross through some of the darkest nights of my life," Steve said, "and tonight, it reminded me why I still carry it." Then, in one quiet motion, he extended the chain toward Keanu. Keanu's face shifted, his body stiffened. "Steve," he said, barely able to finish the sentence. I can't." Steve nodded, not offended, not surprised. "I know what it means to you," Keanu added. "That's not something you just hand over." Steve leaned closer. "You've carried enough pain in your life, brother," he said. "Enough weight, enough silence. Maybe it's time you carried something different." Keanu blinked, his throat tightening. "But this helped you through your worst days?" Steve held the crucifix out again, steady. "And now it'll help you through yours." Keanu reached forward, slowly, as if taking something sacred from an altar. His fingers trembled as he touched the cross, then curled it gently into his palm. He didn't put it around his neck, he just held it for a long moment, like it was breathing. Tears formed in his eyes, but he didn't wipe them away. "I've never told anyone this," he said, voice breaking. "But when I saw that cross in your video, before you even spoke, something inside me whispered, maybe this pain won't be the end. I didn't understand it then, but I do now." He looked up. It was never just a symbol, it was a signal, and it's been pointing me here, to this exact moment. Steve was quiet, tears glistening but not falling. His voice came low and sure. "Then carry it now. Not for me, not even for her. Carry it for every night you thought you wouldn't make it. Carry it for every silent cry. Carry it for the part of you that still believes healing is possible." Keanu closed his eyes. Then, with care, he lifted the crucifix and placed it gently around his neck. It didn't feel like jewelry. It felt like armor, like peace, like purpose. The two men didn't speak again. They didn't need to. They just sat, side by side, no cameras, no audience, no applause, just presence. And somewhere in that quiet grace lingered. 3 days had passed since the taping of the show. The world had seen the Keanu Reeves interview, But what they hadn't seen, what was never meant to be seen, was what happened after the cameras stopped rolling, until someone leaked it. It began as a grainy 30-second clip captured by a backstage assistant who'd quietly recorded the moment when Keanu and Steve embraced off-camera. It showed them in the hallway behind the set, heads bowed, both men in tears. No words, just raw, unfiltered emotion. Keanu's hand rested on Steve's shoulder. Steve clutched the crucifix around his neck, then pressed it gently into Keanu's palm. The clip hit the internet under a single caption, "The realest moment in TV history." It spread like wildfire. Comment sections exploded with tear-filled responses. People didn't just watch the video, they felt it. It didn't matter if they were fans of Keanu, Steve, or neither. Something about two grown men, broken and whole at the same time, holding each other like brothers, spoke louder than any script. But Steve was uneasy. He sat alone in his dressing room, phone in hand, staring at the video looping on every platform. "I didn't plan for that," he muttered. Keanu called him that night. "You okay?" Keanu asked. "Hey, I don't know, man," Steve admitted. "That wasn't supposed to be public, that was private. Sacred." Keanu's voice on the other end was calm, gentle. "I know, but maybe that's why people needed it." Steve didn't speak right away. The silence wasn't awkward. It was heavy. The kind of silence where something sacred is hanging in the air, waiting to be named. "Let them see it," Keanu finally said. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. Steve sighed, his voice cracking. "You sure?" Keanu didn't hesitate. "If even one person out there is sitting in silence, wondering if they matter, this could be their sign." Steve leaned back in his chair, the phone pressed against his ear, heart still wrestling with the vulnerability of it all. "I've always said I talk from the heart," he whispered. "But this feels like I gave them my soul." "You did," Keanu said, "but not to impress. You gave it because you had nothing to hide, and that's what makes it powerful." By the next morning, the clip had surpassed 10 million views. News outlets picked it up, but they didn't sensationalize it. Headlines didn't scream scandal or controversy. Instead, they read, "A moment of healing. Keanu and Steve share tearful off-camera prayer. Faith, grief, and brotherhood, unscripted." Producers at the network called Steve in a panic, wondering if they should remove the clip or lean into the momentum. He told them, "Let it breathe. Don't edit it. Don't polish it. Just post it exactly as it happened." He and Keanu made a decision that morning to release the full version of their post-show moment. Not for ratings, not for fame, but for the people sitting in their own dark rooms, scrolling through life, just like Keanu once did. The caption they chose for the video was simple but true. This wasn't planned, but maybe it was meant to be. And in the first 24 hours, comments poured in by the tens of thousands. One read, "I haven't cried in years, but this broke something open in me, and I needed it." Another, "I've lost people. I've sat in silence. Watching this made me feel seen." And perhaps the most powerful, "I was going to take my life today. Then I saw this. I'm still here." Steve read that one aloud to Keanu later that evening. His voice trembled. "We were just two men talking, man. Just trying to survive." Keanu replied, "And that's what makes it sacred. The world doesn't need more performances. It needs more truth." They didn't need to do a follow-up interview or explain themselves. The video was already doing what it was meant to do: heal, reveal, and remind. That sometimes God uses the footage that was never meant to air to reach the hearts that no sermon ever could. That evening, Steve sat on his porch with a mug of coffee, watching the sun lower itself into the earth. The sky, once a burst of color, had settled into a quiet dusk. He scrolled through the comments again, not out of vanity, but something deeper. A responsibility, almost. He had built a career off humor, timing, and knowing what to say when the world was watching. But this wasn't about being clever or charismatic. This was about being honest, bare, human. He clicked on a message from a young woman in Texas. I was raised in silence, never knew my father. Faith felt fake, but something in your tears, it gave me permission to feel again. Tears welled up in his eyes for what felt like the 100th time that week. He didn't wipe them away. He let them fall, slow and free. The clip had become more than viral. It had become a mirror. People weren't just watching two men cry. They were seeing themselves in that silence. They were recognizing their own grief, their own questions, their own longing to believe in something deeper than performance. Keanu called that night. His voice was softer than usual. "You okay?" he asked. Steve chuckled gently. "I'm still processing, but yeah, I think I'm okay." There was a long pause, not awkward, just still. Then Keanu said, "We opened a wound on stage. But maybe that's how light gets in." Steve nodded, though Keanu couldn't see it. "You think people are ready for more of that? More truth?" "They're starving for it." And so, together, they released a second video. It wasn't edited or lit perfectly. It wasn't framed with network branding or polished sound bites. It was just the two of them, sitting in Steve's dressing room a few days after the taping. No script, no agenda, just reflection. They titled it, "The Story That Wasn't Supposed to Be Told." In the video, Steve looked into the camera and said, "If you're still here, still breathing, then maybe, just maybe, God's not finished with you." I didn't know those words would save someone else. But maybe they did. And maybe they will again. Keanu added, "Sometimes the message you think is meant for others ends up saving the messenger too." They ended with a prayer. Not polished, not perfect, but real. And once again, the world paused to listen. There was a quiet hum in the studio days after the clip aired. Keanu sat alone in his trailer, the crucifix Steve had given him resting in his palm, not hanging around his neck, not yet, but resting. It felt heavy in a different way than he expected, not because of the chain, but because of everything it now represented. He still hadn't figured out what it all meant, but something inside him had changed. The moment hadn't left him. It played over and over in his mind, not like a performance, not like a movie scene, more like something his soul needed to keep watching until it sunk in fully. He kept thinking about how Steve had looked at him, not with celebrity awe or scripted emotion, but with tears and truth, and something Keanu hadn't felt in years. Kinship. Not just shared fame, but shared ache. Shared questions. Shared faith. When he walked back onto the Steve Harvey Show stage for a quiet follow-up, just the two of them, no studio audience, no production notes, the room felt different, hushed, like a sanctuary more than a set. Steve was already there, sitting in his chair in a loose gray sweater, no suit, no tie, no persona. Just Steve. Real and stripped down, like the story they had told had changed more than just viewers, it had changed them. Steve looked up as Keanu approached and gave a slow nod. "You good?" he asked, simple but sincere. Keanu sat down, his hand still holding the cross, loosely. "I think I'm getting there." Steve smiled gently. "Me too." They sat in silence for a moment, not because they didn't have anything to say, but because the silence now had meaning. They weren't afraid of it anymore. "You ever think about what all this actually is?" Steve finally asked, motioning around the empty studio. "The lights, the suits, the smiles, the applause?" Keanu leaned back slightly. "Smoke and mirrors?" Steve laughed. "Yeah, that's one way to put it. But lately, man, I think sometimes it's a pulpit in disguise." Keanu didn't respond right away. Then he looked up, voice soft but steady. "That night we talked, off camera. It rewired something in me. My whole life, I thought silence was safety, that being quiet meant being strong. But it turns out, Silence is just where the truth hides, until someone gives it permission to speak. Steve's eyes glistened again. So what changed? Keanu looked down at the cross in his hands, then back at Steve. Everything, he said. Everything. Steve sat still, eyes focused, not on Keanu, not on the cameras that weren't even rolling, but on something deeper, something inside. You know, he said slowly, I used to think my legacy would be the jokes, the shows, the laughs I pulled out of people's pockets when they had none left. But lately, I wonder... Keanu leaned in, listening, giving him space. Steve continued, what if the real legacy isn't what people remember about us, but what we awaken in them? That landed hard. Keanu smiled faintly, nodding. It's strange. I've played 1,000 roles in my life, Steve. Action stars, tortured poets, broken sons. But nothing ever felt as real as telling you the truth, that I was ready to give up, and that your words kept me here. He paused, his voice tighter now. And I've started asking myself, what am I actually doing with this life I was so close to leaving? Steve sat back, folding his hands. You're doing it right now, brother. You're living with intention. Keanu looked down. I used to think the only way to matter was through what the world applauded, but after that night I realized something. Maybe the real stage was never the screen. Maybe it was this. Sitting across from someone, soul to soul, saying, I see you. Steve nodded. And maybe the spotlight was never the reward, just the setup. The message, that's the main act. The room went still again, but not with silence. This time, it was reverence. Like two men had arrived at a truth that didn't belong in headlines or hashtags. It belonged in the heart. Keanu tilted his head. Do you know how many times I've stood on sets where the script said, save the world? He chuckled lightly. But no one ever wrote a line where the character had to save himself first? Steve leaned forward. That's the real script, man. That's the one God writes in pencil first, so he can rewrite it through people like us. Keanu looked at him, eyes glinting with gratitude. That's why I think you're more than a host, more than a brand. You're a message, walking. Steve blinked rapidly, overcome. You think so? He whispered. Keanu reached out, hand over Steve's. I know. Steve exhaled, long and slow, then looked toward the empty rows of the now cleared audience seating. Funny, he said. All those people came to see a show, and we ended up having church. Keanu gave a soft smile, almost reverent. That's what happens when truth walks in. Steve's voice turned quiet, reflective. I've been in this business a long time, chased ratings, memorized punchlines. But this right here, this moment, it made me feel something I ain't felt in years. Keanu nodded. You felt seen. Steve wiped his face with the back of his hand. I felt called. They sat there, no cameras, no applause, just two men stripped of celebrity, clothed in something sacred, the kind of moment you don't stage, the kind of healing you don't schedule. Keanu stood slowly and said, You changed my life, Steve, but tonight, you let me change yours too. Steve stood beside him, and for a long, breathless moment, two stars who had once fallen shined. The idea came quietly, without a meeting or press release, just a conversation between two men sitting in a green room, still echoing from tears. It was Keanu who said it first, almost to himself. You know who we never talk about? The people who save lives in silence. Steve turned toward him, brow furrowed. Keanu continued, Not the heroes on magazine covers. I mean the janitor who gives a kid his only smile that day. The waitress who notices a scar and chooses kindness over judgment. The cab driver who listens when no one else does. Steve nodded slowly, his heart already moving ahead of his voice. The ones we forget to see. And that was it. They called it the Silent Lights Project. A foundation with one mission, to find and honor the unseen givers of the world. Not with trophies, not with cameras, but with visibility, with acknowledgement. A few friends joined in quietly. They reached out to hospitals, schools, shelters, churches. The stories started coming in, handwritten notes, email messages, voice memos from people who'd never spoken their gratitude out loud until now. One woman wrote in about her neighbor, a retired school teacher who had been secretly leaving groceries on doorsteps for struggling families during the pandemic. She signed it, "To the woman who gave without needing to be seen, thank you." Steve read that one aloud to Keanu, his voice catching halfway through. This is the ministry." Keanu nodded. "This is why we're still here." They didn't announce their involvement publicly. There were no red carpets, no celebrity endorsements, just quiet posts, a black and white photo, a name, a story. Sometimes just a line or two, sometimes a full letter. And at the end of each story, one simple sentence appeared. "This light may be quiet, but it still shines." The response was overwhelming. Within days, thousands of submissions flooded in. People from all over the country writing in about nannies, security guards, teachers, bus drivers, barbers, mechanics, even strangers they met once and never saw again. The world, it seemed, had been waiting for someone to notice its silent lights. Steve and Keanu never imagined the floodgates they had opened. What began as a private act of gratitude turned into something greater, a movement of remembrance, of recognition, of rediscovery. Each morning they'd meet over coffee, Steve in his favorite chair, Keanu seated cross-legged on the floor like he had nowhere more important to be, and they'd read letters, aloud, one by one. A young man from Atlanta wrote about a security guard named Mr. Davis who stood outside his high school, rain or shine. He never let anyone walk in looking broken without giving them a reason to smile, the letter read. He told me, "Don't you quit. You're not done yet." That one sentence kept me alive. Another came from a nurse in Chicago who shared the story of a hospital janitor who would sing old jazz songs in the children's cancer wing. No one knew his name. The kids just called him Mr. Magic. She wrote, "He gave those kids a soundtrack to their courage." And then there was a story about a woman who worked the night shift at a diner. No one ever asked her name, but every night she slipped a warm muffin into a paper bag for a homeless man who waited across the street, too ashamed to come in. "She saved my father's dignity," the writer said, "and I don't think she even knows it." Each letter made Steve and Keanu quieter and more resolute. They began sending handwritten thank you cards to some of these silent heroes, sometimes a grocery gift card, sometimes an invitation to a community dinner, sometimes just a note saying, "You were seen." They never attached their names. It wasn't about that. Steve often repeated a line Keanu had once whispered to him backstage, now etched into his memory like scripture. Sometimes God hides the brightest lights in the quietest places. The team started compiling the stories into a digital archive, a living wall of honor. No filters, no edits, just real names, real people, real moments. The world had enough influencers. What it needed was reminders. Reminders that sometimes the most sacred work goes completely unseen. One afternoon, Keanu and Steve were invited to speak at a small inner-city school where one of the silent lights, a retired bus driver named Miss Geraldine, had once worked. She had passed away 2 months earlier, but her legacy lived on through dozens of hand-scrawled stories pinned to a hallway bulletin board. "She gave us more than rides," one student wrote. "She gave us peace." As Steve walked those halls, his heart full, he looked at Keanu and said, "They never wrote about her in the papers, but she left a bigger mark than most of us ever will." Keanu nodded. "That's why we're doing this." They announced a new feature of the Silent Lights Project, the Geraldine Award, given annually to someone who changes lives without ever seeking the spotlight. That year it went posthumously to Miss Geraldine. Her daughter accepted the honor with tears running down her face, whispering into the mic, "My mama thought no one noticed." Steve held her hand and said gently, "We noticed." And maybe that's what the whole mission had become, a lifelong commitment to noticing what the world had forgotten, to reminding people that even the smallest acts of kindness echo through eternity. As they stood outside the school that day, watching the sun pour golden light across the pavement, Keanu said quietly, "You know what I've learned?" Steve looked over. "It's not about being remembered by millions," Keanu said. "It's about being remembered by one person, for doing something that mattered." Steve smiled, his eyes warm. "Then I think we've finally figured it out." They got back in the car without fanfare, without cameras. No applause followed them, no red carpet waited. But in the silence, there was meaning. In the quiet, there was legacy. They were just two men carrying torches, lit by the ones the world never saw. And with every story they shared, with every unsung hero they honored, they lit another. The lights dimmed in homes and hearts across the country as the full interview aired for the first time on national television. It was promoted only with a simple line, a conversation that changed both men forever. No flashy titles, no previews of tears, just trust. Within minutes of the episode airing, phones began lighting up across living rooms. Social media feeds buzzed, not with scandal or gossip, but with stunned silence. Hashtags like "The Conversation," "Silent Strength," and "The Crucifix Moment" exploded across platforms, not because people were outraged, but because they were moved beyond words. Steve Harvey had sat across from Keanu Reeves, and something sacred had unfolded. There was no script, no production interference, just a truth shared between two men who had been wounded by life and somehow healed through each other. That moment, the passing of the crucifix, Keanu's whispered confession that "this saved my life," was clipped, captioned, and replayed millions of times within hours. On TikTok, teenagers stitched it with personal stories of depression. On Facebook, parents shared it with captions like, "Show this to your son before it's too late." The reach went beyond entertainment. Teachers began playing it in classrooms, especially during Mental Health Week. One elementary school in Georgia reported 3 students who asked to speak to the counselor because of what Keanu said. Churches wove the footage into sermons. One pastor in Chicago scrapped his Sunday message and simply played the clip. And then came the letters. At first, just a few, then dozens, then hundreds. Typed emails, handwritten notes, videos filmed on trembling phones. They came from all corners of America, from hospitals, shelters, rehab centers, churches, military bases, even a prison block in Texas. One letter arrived that froze time for Steve and Keanu alike. It came in a simple white envelope with no return address. Inside, a single page. The handwriting was shaky, the ink smudged at the edges like someone had held the page with trembling hands. The note read, "I was going to take my life last night. I had everything planned. The pills were lined up. The note was written. Then I saw a clip of you two, Steve holding the cross, Keanu saying he stayed because of a stranger's words. Something shifted. I sat back down. I cried for hours. And this morning, for the first time in years, I asked for help. I'm still here because of that moment. Thank you for saving a stranger you'll never meet." Steve read it aloud in his dressing room with Keanu by his side. Neither spoke for a long time. Keanu stared at the letter, his eyes unmoving. Steve had tears on his cheeks, not from sadness, but from reverence. The silence that followed that letter was unlike any Steve or Keanu had known. It wasn't hollow, it wasn't heavy, it was sacred. Reverent, like the world itself had paused to honor a life still breathing because 2 men chose to tell the truth. Steve finally set the letter down, his fingers lingering at the edges as if afraid it might vanish. "This," he whispered, his voice cracking, "this is why." Keanu nodded, eyes still locked on the words. "It was never about fame," he said quietly, "never about image or platform. It was about this. One life. The room they were in, Steve's private dressing room, had been used for laughter, rehearsals, pep talks, but in that moment it became something more, a sanctuary. The weight of that single note reminded them that what they'd shared on stage wasn't just a televised conversation, it was a lifeline for someone drowning in silence. That night, calls flooded the studio, not angry hotlines or controversy complaints, but gratitude. One woman said her estranged father reached out to her for the first time in 12 years. Another said she showed the clip to her teenage son, who hadn't spoken more than 5 words in a month. He hugged her afterward and said, "That felt like me." One man called in from a truck stop in Kansas. His voice cracked through the line. I just pulled over to cry," he said. "I didn't know it was okay for men to talk like that. I didn't know it was allowed." As stories like these poured in, Steve and Keanu sat in quiet awe. They had planned nothing, rehearsed nothing, yet the ripple they started was becoming a wave, moving through families, communities, even faiths. And then something unexpected happened. A school principal from rural Mississippi emailed the studio asking permission to show the full clip to students during a school-wide assembly. His reason? One of his 7th graders, a quiet boy who never raised his hand in class, had stood up after watching the clip and said, "I think God might still see me." That boy's words echoed in Steve's head for days. God might still see me. He repeated it quietly to himself, like a prayer with no punctuation. Just possibility. And Keanu, when he heard it, closed his eyes and said, "That's what I felt when I saw your message. That's the whisper I couldn't explain." A whisper. That's what the media began calling it. The whisper heard around the world. A trending topic. A movement hashtag. But beneath all the digital noise was something older, something deeper. An ancient truth dressed in modern simplicity. When 2 men told the truth, healing followed. And the most incredible part? They weren't trying to change the world. They were just trying not to drown. Days after the episode aired, a major television network reran the segment during primetime. The ratings soared. Not because of celebrity gossip or scandal, but because people were starving for something real. Something honest. Something that reminded them they weren't alone. Churches across the country began playing the clip during Sunday sermons. Pastors paused their planned messages to talk about pain, silence, faith, and the unseen ministry in everyday life. One pastor in Detroit said, "This isn't just entertainment, this is testimony." Schools started hosting quiet reflection sessions, showing students the part where Keanu talked about grief and how it didn't have to define them. One teacher wrote in, "For the first time in years, 3 of my students stayed after class just to talk, to cry, to feel seen." Steve and Keanu began receiving letters, thousands of them, some handwritten, some typed, some stained with tears. "I lost my son," one woman wrote. "I haven't been able to speak since, but your story reminded me that silence doesn't mean the story is over." Another, from a military veteran, said, "I've seen things I can't forget, but your message reminded me that broken doesn't mean useless. It just means needed in a different way." The most humbling moment came when Steve received a message from a young woman who had once been homeless. She said she remembered Steve handing her a meal years ago in Chicago. "I didn't recognize you until I saw that episode," she wrote, "but I never forgot your voice. It was the first kind thing anyone had said to me in months." Steve held that letter to his chest and cried, not because he was proud, but because he hadn't remembered. Kindness, when real, doesn't tally itself. And Keanu, quiet, reflective Keanu, became even more certain of one truth, that the smallest acts done in silence often echo the loudest. This wasn't a moment, he told Steve, sitting in the same chair where it all started. This was a mirror. It showed people the sacred in themselves. Steve nodded, his voice low, full of emotion. "We didn't just tell a story. No, Keanu agreed. We lived it out loud. And from that living, unfiltered, unrehearsed, real, came something more powerful than either man could have planned. Not just healing, a movement, a reminder that sometimes the whisper that saves someone else is the one you almost didn't speak. The studio had never felt this still, not even during commercial breaks, not during emotional interviews, not even during farewells. But now, as Keanu sat forward in his chair, voice hushed and hands open, there was a sacred weight in the air. Across from him, Steve Harvey wasn't hosting anymore. He wasn't performing or guiding. He was receiving, fully present in a way the cameras could barely capture. Keanu's gaze didn't wander. It held Steve's, grounded and unwavering. "You once said something," Keanu began, "something that changed everything for me. You didn't know who it would reach. You weren't dressed up, it wasn't rehearsed. You were standing under soft lights in front of a small church crowd, wearing the same crucifix you have on now. And your voice, it wasn't loud, but it carried." Steve blinked, already emotional, already remembering. Keanu continued, slower now. "You said, God doesn't always use the mighty. Sometimes he chooses the broken, the ones who've bled quietly, because they don't preach. They reach, because their pain speaks a language too deep for pride." Steve's hand went to his heart. "You said, if you feel invisible, it's because your light is still forming. If you're still breathing, it's because God's not finished with you." Silence. Not emptiness. Reverence. Steve closed his eyes, his shoulders rising slightly with the weight of the words he'd forgotten. Words he once gave the world when no one clapped, when he didn't know if they'd land. "I remember," Steve whispered. "I didn't think anyone would." Keanu smiled softly. "I did, word for word. And I've been carrying it with me ever since." Steve tried to speak again, but his throat tightened, his lips quivered, his hand was still over his chest. Keanu leaned forward just a bit. "I want to give it back to you now. Not just to honor you, but because I think maybe you forgot how powerful those words were." He took a breath, then spoke gently. "You gave me a reason to breathe again, Steve. In a season where I thought I'd already taken my last, meaningful breath." The tears came quietly this time. Not from sorrow, not even from surprise, but from recognition, from being seen. "You weren't just talking," Keanu added. "You were surviving out loud, and that survival, it saved someone else's life." Steve's eyes overflowed. No words now, just knowing. Just memory returning with new purpose. And then Keanu gave the final line back, the one that had stayed buried deep in his chest all these years. "You don't need a pulpit to preach, you just need pain, and the courage to speak from it." And in that moment, neither of them needed to say anything else. They both knew. They always had. Steve sat there, unmoving, hand still resting on his chest. The studio around them faded into background. No laughter, no lights, no production cues. Just the weight of a moment that felt entirely untouched by performance. He tried to form words, but they came out as fragments. I was just trying to survive back then." Keanu nodded. "That's why it worked." Steve looked up. His eyes were red but focused. "I wasn't trying to save anyone, Keanu. I wasn't even thinking about that. I was trying to talk myself out of quitting." "And you did," Keanu replied gently. "And because you kept going, so did I." The stillness that followed wasn't awkward. It was sacred. It was the kind of silence that only shows up when something eternal passes between two people. No applause chased the moment. No dramatic music swelled. It simply was. Steve finally leaned forward. You really think God used that? Used me?" Keanu didn't flinch. "I don't think, Steve. I know." He let the sentence land. You weren't speaking as a celebrity, Keanu added. You were speaking as a man who had seen darkness and still had enough light left in him to shine for someone else. That's ministry. That's testimony. Steve's voice cracked. You keep saying that word, ministry, but I'm not a preacher. I'm a talk show host. I tell jokes. Keanu smiled. That's exactly why it works, because you're not trying to be anything but honest. You don't wear a robe, Steve. You wear a suit and a cross. But the effect is the same. Steve wiped at his eyes, laughing softly now through tears. I still don't see myself that way. You don't have to, Keanu said. Because ministry isn't always about what you preach. Sometimes it's about what you survive and who you lift while you're surviving. The word settled deep in Steve's chest. In that instant, a subtle but powerful shift happened. Something softened in him. The doubt that had always crept into the quiet moments, the voice that questioned whether any of it mattered, was silenced. Keanu placed a hand gently on Steve's shoulder. You've carried the pain of your past, and instead of letting it destroy you, you turned it into something healing. That's not just strength. That's sacred. Steve closed his eyes again, and when he opened them, something was different. His shoulders were lighter, his breathing slower, his hands, once trembling, were still. I don't know what to call it, he said quietly, but maybe I have been carrying something holy after all? Keanu nodded. You have. You just didn't know it had a name. And what name is that? Steve asked, almost afraid of the answer. Keanu's voice was calm. Hope. Steve didn't reply. He just sat there, finally receiving what he had unknowingly given to others for years. And in that quiet, he began to believe it too. Steve rested his hands on his lap, looking down, as if the floor beneath him suddenly carried the weight of every person he'd unknowingly helped. The years of doubt, the nights spent questioning, the guilt of being imperfect, it all seemed to settle into something else now. Not regret, not pride, just peace. Then Keanu shifted in his seat. His tone softened even more, if that were possible. There's something I've wanted to say for a long time, he said, and I want to say it now, word for word. Steve looked over, curious. Keanu took a breath. He wasn't performing, he was remembering. God doesn't always use the mighty or the perfect, Keanu began. Sometimes he chooses the broken, the ones nobody expects, because they know how to reach people the strong can't. Steve inhaled sharply. You don't need a pulpit to preach, Keanu continued. You don't need a robe to be called. You don't need a church to carry the word. Sometimes your pain is your ministry, and your comedy is just the disguise God uses to send people hope. A single tear slid down Steve's cheek. You said those words, Steve. That night, that video. You didn't write them down, you didn't plan them. You just opened your mouth, and heaven poured out. Steve's jaw trembled, his lips parting in disbelief. You remembered all that? I didn't just remember it, Keanu said. I carried it. Silence filled the room again. Not dead air, living, breathing reverence. It was the kind of pause where something sacred had just been placed in the middle of the space between two human beings. Steve couldn't speak. His hand found the spot where the crucifix used to hang, the weight now passed on, yet still resting in his chest. Keanu leaned forward. You saved me, Steve. That was it. Not a monologue, not a headline. Just 5 words that cracked open the soul of a man who had spent his entire life trying to be enough. Steve didn't cry this time. Not from sorrow. These tears were different. They came from being seen, from being understood, from finally receiving the very grace he had poured out into the world. And for the first time in a long, long time, Steve Harvey didn't feel like he had to carry it alone. He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat, and whispered, Then I'll keep going. Keanu smiled. "Good," he said, "because there are more people out there quietly breaking who need what you carry." Steve exhaled, deeply. The camera didn't zoom, the lights didn't flash. There was no fanfare, no catchphrase, no standing ovation. Just two men, one truth, and one mission that had just been handed back word for word from the life it helped save. Sometimes the most important thing you'll ever do is something you didn't even know someone needed. One small sentence, one gesture, one moment of honesty. That might be the exact light someone was searching for in the dark. Keanu Reeves steps forward and looks straight into the camera. The studio has gone quiet. This isn't part of the show anymore. This is something more. He says, "What if the words you say when no one's watching are the ones that save a life? What if the way you carry your pain becomes the permission someone else needs to heal from theirs?" Some people think influence is about millions of followers or standing on a stage. But real influence? It's when your truth touches one person who thought they were alone. This moment, this story, was never meant to go viral. It wasn't supposed to become a headline. It was just two men sitting with their pain and letting the light through. But that's the beauty of it. Real doesn't need a script. It just needs to be seen. We live in a world full of noise, scrolling, posting, performing, but every once in a while something cuts through all of it. Something quiet, something real. A prayer whispered backstage, a hug that said more than any microphone ever could. A cross passed from one heart to another. Not because of fame, but because of faith. This story isn't just about Steve Harvey. It isn't just about Keanu Reeves. It's about you. It's about the teacher who stayed after school to listen, the janitor who said the right words at the right time, the nurse who held your hand when no one else was there. It's about the cab driver who noticed the tears in your eyes and didn't ask questions, just turned up the music. It's about the waitress who told you that you mattered. It's about the stranger on a screen who said something that made you get out of bed when nothing else could. You never know who's watching. You never know who's listening. You never know who's on the edge, just waiting for a reason to hold on. So if you've ever felt unseen, unheard, unimportant, this story is for you. You matter. Your words matter. Your life matters. Maybe no one ever told you that before, but someone should have, and we're telling you now. You matter. Sometimes the greatest thing you'll ever do is survive your own story. Sometimes that survival becomes someone else's lifeline, just by showing up, just by being real, just by staying. If you've ever helped someone without knowing it, you're part of this story. If someone helped you without realizing how deeply they touched your life, they're part of this too. Let's stop waiting for heroes in capes and start honoring the ones in uniforms, aprons, hoodies, and broken shoes, the ones with soft eyes and steady voices, the ones who don't preach but love anyway. Let's remember the ones who spoke life into silence, who showed up with a flashlight when you were drowning in the dark, the ones who didn't walk away when your pain made you hard to love, the ones who stayed anyway. This story is not entertainment. This is a reminder that grace is still real, that love still matters, that kindness is never wasted. So here's the invitation. If someone changed your life without even knowing it, tell them. If someone gave you a second chance when you thought it was over, thank them. And if you've been carrying light quietly for years, this is your moment to know it mattered. This story is dedicated to the unseen heroes, to the ministers in disguise, to the comedians who preached without a pulpit, to the janitors who saved souls with a smile, to the mothers who gave without applause, to the fathers who kept showing up, to the strangers who never got a thank you but kept loving anyway. Maybe you're one of them. Maybe someone else was for you. Either way, this moment is for both of you. You are the reason this story exists. You are the whisper that saved someone's life. You are the light they'll never forget. So let the world see what healing looks like. Let the world feel what grace sounds like, and let the story keep going, because someone out there is still in the dark, and maybe your voice will be the one that calls them back. Now we ask, who changed your life without even knowing it? Tell us in the comments, share their name, share their story. Let them be seen. And if this story touched you, if you felt something you haven't felt in a long time, share it. Send it to someone you love, someone you lost, someone who helped you, someone who needs to know that even in the silence, hope is still speaking. This story is dedicated to every person who ever whispered a prayer into the void, to every heart that stayed soft even when life gave them every reason not to. To you, this is not the end. This is the beginning. You're still breathing, which means your story is not over. Now go be someone's whisper and let someone be yours.